Good evening, everyone. Welcome here. Thank you for being here with us for another inner hour. I appreciate it. Um, given that the Super Bowl's tonight, I wasn't sure, how that might affect things, but I'm probably going to catch part of it myself later, even though I'm not, I'm not much of a uh, follower of any of the teams anymore these days, but still enjoy watching some of them. Anyway, welcome. I'm going to start the way I usually do with just a moment of quiet and focus and lighting a candle here. So I invite you to take a moment wherever you are and just kind of bring your attention present, let go of whatever may have occupied you today or that you may still be caught up in from this week, and just give yourself a little space to be present and relax. So there's my new, and he got me a new taper candle because my other one was pretty spent last week. So thank you. Alrighty. So we're continuing with our series on the nature of consciousness, and um, as usual, I think what I'm going to do is just bring up a couple of ideas or topics, and then hopefully we'll open it up to the group and see where we are with questions and insights from people besides me. So, uh, so we talked some last week about the difference between awareness and consciousness, and sort of getting a sense of how we might look at those or understand those. This week, more specifically, I want to talk about types of consciousness, and of course, you're welcome to bring in any questions or realizations or insights you may have had uh, about awareness as well, or things from last week that we didn't get to. So the three basic things I'd like to touch on tonight, we'll see if we get through them or if we don't, are kind of in mystical spiritual traditions, aspects of consciousness that are talked about a lot. They're perspectives on types of spiritual consciousness that people have experienced or believe human beings can experience if they haven't experienced it themselves. And so I want to talk about some of those. And before we do that, the first thing I want to say is that in terms of spiritual literature dealing with these sorts of things, um, most Western spiritual literature is has far less on the nature of consciousness and awareness in general than Eastern literature does, particularly really ancient Eastern literature like the Vedas, and many of the Hindu writings explore the nature of consciousness a lot. And there are and were many people over there, yogis, sadhus, mystics of various kinds, that have claimed to experience these higher states of consciousness and describe them, including often uh, sharing methods of how to develop or experience or sometimes sustain these higher states of consciousness. And and so in the 60s and 70s, in the New Age, loosely called movement, there was a lot of interest in Eastern philosophy. So much of that started coming over in the late 1920s, actually, with Guru Paramahansa Yogananda, with Hamid Bey from the Coptic Fellowship, with others who specifically came from Eastern traditions, primarily Indian, to bring those teachings to the West. And a little bit later, Sufis brought their version over, and so on. And so in the 60s, yoga was a brand new term over here. Meditation was a brand new term over here. In general, I mean, there are certainly smaller pockets that talked about it. Got much more widespread coverage in those days, and since then. So meditation is kind of nobody's shocked to like, what? What is meditation or yoga? It's all pretty familiar. Although most people think of yoga in the sense of doing physical exercises as opposed to what it really means, which is union, to unite yourself with the divine. Um, but so a lot of it's Eastern in orientation. And then again, during the kind of larger category of New Age movement, many of the Eastern ideas about awareness, about consciousness, about higher realms of existence and those sorts of things were brought into Western culture and Westernized. And so a lot of what we hear, say, for example, of Buddhism here is kind of Western Americanized understanding of Buddhism. And if you really look at the earliest Buddhist sutras and so on, um, you can see a difference there. And like you can if you look at Christian doctrine and teaching today and the early writings about Yeshua and or by his apostles, quite a difference you see there, um, and so on. So so I'm going to start with something that was in the East was, and again we're translating, cultures and languages and mindsets, which is never a clean transition. There's always something lost or slightly changed, but the first of the three, I'll name the three and I'll talk about the first one. The three I'd like to talk about tonight are self-realization. What is that? The second is enlightenment. What is that? Is it the same thing, different? How does that relate? And then the third is something called Christ consciousness. So we'll try to get to all those tonight, and if we don't, we'll keep going, more with whatever we didn't get finished next week. So as a kind of an intro to each of those three, I'll share briefly about each one and then open it up to the group. The idea of self-realization is that this is out of Hinduism primarily. It was moved into Buddhism and then other traditions, but it really arose, as far as I can tell, initially in, in very ancient Hinduism, somewhere between 4 and 6,000 BC, which is about the time of, well, it doesn't matter, but anyway, it's old. And the essential ideas, as I grasp them, it, it center around that most people go through life in what these ancient writings would call a sleep state or the walking dead state. That was a phrase that was used sometimes too. The idea that we are primarily conscious at a normal daily waking consciousness physical level. You're aware that I'm sitting here talking to you, you're seeing my image and hearing my voice. You're looking at a computer or a device of some kind. You're aware of your room. You're aware if you're hungry or hot or cold, if you feel good or you don't feel so good, if this aches or that aches. We have all these things that we are conscious of, and they tend to be very physically, three-dimensionally, time-space oriented. And we tend to think of ourselves as, this is me, this guy you see on camera, that's Stephen. He looks like that. He's an old guy. He talks like this. He thinks like that. This is him. The idea of self-realization is that there is a core self that is not the body and that existed prior to embodiment and exists after this body goes through the process of death and then dissolution. That the core self remains. It was prior to this life, it will be prior after this life. That self in a lot of literature, both Eastern and now Western, is talked about as the soul, like the individualized soul, or the individualized spark of God, or the indwelling presence of God. There are lots of language around all these things, and some of these languages mean exactly the same thing as near as you can pin it down, and some of these language phrases mean actually slightly different than one another, and are nuanced, and they really don't mean the same thing, but they're similar. So it's a if it's something that you study, you've noticed that there's a lot to it, and it can be a lifelong study. So this idea that there's this core self or real self, that another concept out of the Eastern Hindu traditions and later Buddhist is um, the illusory nature of the body and of the world itself. And in the West, that's often been, in my opinion, been misunderstood. In the West, when we talk about the world is an illusion, or the body is an illusion, or time space is an illusion, or any of those kind of things, the sense that most presented in the Western understanding of that is that the world itself, all the physicality of the world itself, is an illusion, meaning it's false. It has no substance. It doesn't exist. That is absolutely not what Judaism teaches. Even mystical Judaism and Kabbalistic practices do not teach illusion in that way. And if you read the original scriptures, and I'm talking about things like the Vedas, the Upanishads, particularly the Rig Veda, the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, and a number of things like that, um, you'll see that the illusory nature of it that they're talking about is that it's transient. That's the key element. The illusion comes that everything physical is transient. It has a distinct beginning, a duration in time where it exists, and then a distinct ending. So this body, for example, 76 years ago did not exist. It exists now. It had a time when it came into physical existence. It's existed ever since that moment. It's still existing, thank God, and hopefully will exist for quite a while, I hope. But eventually it won't. So this is transitory. All physical form is transitory. My grandmother's house, in which we had great memories and great family gatherings and lots of wonderful, in my life, lots of wonderful experiences. That house doesn't even exist. You can't even see where it used to be. It's just not there. And to anybody living in the world today, passing by the spot where that was and where all these amazing things happened, there's absolutely no indication anything was ever built there or ever happened there. It's gone. It was transient. The illusory part comes in where our mind, in seeing something, believes that it's permanent. It believes I'm always going to be alive in this body. It acts like that. Not true, but that's the illusion. The illusion is that we believe what is transient to be permanent. That's the illusory part. Not illusory in the sense that it wasn't real. Just as a kind of an analogy, take magicians, great magicians, and you watch them, whether it's card manipulators or bigger illusionists that make buses in the Empire State Buildings disappear and all that stuff. Even if you're live in a performance and watching it in person, fairly close up, you're watching it and you would swear that what you're seeing actually happened. This person actually was sawed in half, actually floated in the air, actually was disappeared. Now, you know that's not so because you've had enough sophistication and life experience and so on. You realize the magicians are illusionists. So what you're believing out of what you see is in fact false. But the illusion part is something real is happening, and even what you think is happening, something is actually happening that's making you think that. They're distracting you from what is happening. They're making you focus on something else that's happening, but they're arranging the something else that's happening to appear from your vantage point in a particular way that makes you then believe, oh, that disappeared. Oh, this just manifested. It's all very carefully constructed to do that. But none of it's false in the sense that there really was a person there. They didn't actually disappear, but it was manipulated to make it look like that, and you believed it. That's the illusion. It's not that there were no human beings in the act. It's not that there wasn't really a platform that they climbed up on or a rope that was there. All those things are real. So the idea that the world doesn't matter or doesn't exist or is illusion in the sense that it's fake or non-existence is not an Eastern teaching. But it's kind of a Western mm, twist on that. The original idea was it's all impermanent, and believing that it's not is an illusion. Buddha went further later, if we get into talking about that, and basically said, and that illusion causes suffering, your attachment to that illusion. Anyway, so self-realization, the idea is there's a core self in the midst of all this. There is a me that experiences through this body during my life, but the core me was existent prior to this body and will be existent after this body. And that core me is what's talked about as the self, or sometimes as the soul. Now, soul does appear in Eastern writings for sure. Um, that concept has gotten probably more developed in the West, and the idea of self more in the East. But self-realization and soul realization are almost synonymous. There are traditions that make a distinction between those, soul realization being higher than self-realization, but they're very, very similar in the essence is that, and it's not a belief structure. It is an experiential, organic um, consciousness that you experience the reality of something rather than have an idea about the reality of something. The self-realization is to have an experience that you are this permanent, real self, soul self, self, Atma in Sanskrit, the individualized soul, uh, um, and so on. There's different aspects of soul. They talk about the Jiva, Atma, and Brahman, and different things, but without getting into all those particulars. So you've come to realize that this self is transient, and you even realize that your emotional nature, your emotional self, if you will, is transient also. It changes all the time, and even your mental aspect, as vast as that is, what you think, how you perceive, how you look at things, how you understand things, what you believe about what you see. All of those mental processes are also transient, but that there's a core self that experiences all of those and through all those. And that core self is what we're talking about in self-realization, finding who is that. And that doesn't die when the body dies. That's the teaching. So it's the realization of the true self. And part of that process is that we also then realize we have a false self. We have a self that we've come to believe in as me and as permanent, but it isn't. And that false self, my notion of me, which is actually not the core, deepest, real, permanent me, my notion of me and my belief that that transient notion of me is the permanent me, that in the East is what's called ego. In the East, it's not the selfish, mean, nasty part of me. It's not that. It's the false self. It's my illusion about myself. That's the ego. And self-realization consists of recognizing that ego is not the real you, and that there is a deeper core you, a true self you. And how do you find that? Coming into the consciousness of that permanent self, that real spiritual self at your core that's experiencing your mind, emotions, body, and in this incarnation. That's self-realization. And being in that state of knowing is the self-realization consciousness. And so in this particular orientation, mind is primary in that. We'll talk about these other two aspects, Christ consciousness and enlightenment, and what's primary in those. But mind is primary in most self-realization practices. Consequently, most self-realization practices have meditation techniques, visualization techniques, affirmation techniques, chant techniques, things that engage the mind to reorient it and help it to re-identify. Self-realization is a process of switching your locus of identity from the ego or false self to the true and permanent self within you. Is a change of identity at your deepest level of knowing. You no longer think of yourself as this transient body or even as this ego who you think you are, but this core spiritual being that is experiencing all these other aspects. So, so it's a re-identification with the true self. The ego is seen as the false self, and the mind is primary in coming into that knowing. And then what they call liberation is achieved through realization of this I am, or this soul, or this divine presence, or this divine spark that you are, coming to know that and be in that state of consciousness as your identity is essentially self-realization. The second one I'll talk about is enlightenment. All of these are obviously huge topics. So I'm kind of trying to pare down to what I think are essentials of them. Enlightenment is primarily a Buddhist concept, and the core emphasis on that is freedom from suffering. And there are four noble truths. There's an eightfold path. There's a number of practices that Gautama, the original Buddha, um, brought forward that he used to come into that realization, and that people still use in Buddhism. All the various Buddhisms now are some variation of his practices to come into this awareness of how do we free ourselves from unnecessary suffering. And um, he used the Hindu concept at core of seeing through the illusions, but he went a step further and said, not only do you need to see through the illusory transient stuff, that it's not permanent, but the search for the true self, the search to find this real deep core you that experiences all this, that's at the middle of all of it, that itself is fruitless. There is no core self. There's no self. So there's a teaching in Buddhism about no self, and that essentially consciousness is an aggregate of experiences that we hold, and our consciousness is formed by that. But as far as a permanent core self, there isn't one. And that teaching is very, very prominent in modern Western versions of Buddhism right now. There are some problems with that. There are problems with everything. I mean, you can nitpick anything. But one of the kind of core or essential problems with that, and it's not exactly what Buddha taught. Again, what he taught was more along the lines of not that there isn't this core self that Hinduism talks about, but that the driven search, I must find that self, causes suffering, and that the attachment to self-realization is another cause of suffering, and that we need to let go of that. It's more of a letting go of that self than that there isn't such a self. A letting go of the driven desperation to find that true self that we need to let go of. Because Buddha positively taught reincarnation. If there's nothing permanent about us, exactly what is it that reincarnates? So there's a fundamental philosophical problem there with the versions of Buddhism that say there's nothing permanent and no self, and yet talk about reincarnation. So the Dalai Lama, that's the present Dalai Lama, is supposedly the Dalai Lama that's been the Dalai Lama for generations and generations of incarnations, same soul. So if there's nothing there that keeps re-embodying, how come that's the same guy? So there's some philosophical issues with some of these things. But the other aspect of the original Buddha's teaching is the idea of coming to terms with impermanence and emptiness, that at its core, all forms are essentially empty, and that, as I said before, all forms are impermanent. No matter how much you love anything, a plant, a pet, a person, yourself, at this level of physicality, all of it will pass. All things must pass, as the saying goes. And so getting attached to any of those becomes a source of suffering because you are destined to lose all of them. And so Buddhism's realization was that life at this level inherently has suffering involved. And we suffer more when we are strongly attached to things and won't release them when it's time for them to go. So learning to release is a key to suffering far less than if we don't learn to do that. And because wisdom recognizes the truth of the things I just said that Buddha presented, compassion, once we understand that, naturally arises. We have compassion for other living sentient beings because they suffer like we do, and they go through the same dilemmas that we do. And so we can have compassion for them because even when they fail or disappoint us or whatever, because they're struggling souls like we are, essentially. So in this focus of enlightenment, in this way I'm presenting it, mind is actually not primary. It's a stepping stone. Awareness, pure awareness, is considered one of the highest states possible, and transcending attachment to any particular form of identity, any particular form of spiritual practice, any particular form of meditation, but this transcendence of just pure awareness of being is the primary component of reaching enlightenment in the sense that Buddha talked about. So that's two of the three. The first, self-realization, the second, enlightenment. The last is the Christ consciousness. And Christ consciousness is a relatively new term, meaning only a couple thousand years old, probably, or less. In Kabbalistic literature, they talk about messianic consciousness, which is very similar in nature. It's a consciousness of oneness and a much more expansive consciousness than our typical everyday. And in Western tradition that talks about Christ, of course, being related to Jesus, the idea in mystical interpretation, rather than fundamentalist or literal interpretation, was that he held a certain type of consciousness that most of us don't. Not because he was the one and only who could ever do that, but because he reached the pinnacle of human potential and demonstrated through his life what that potential is. And that potential, the awareness with which he lived, the perspective with which he saw the world and the creator and spirit and everything that is, the way he related to the world and souls in it, the compassionate heart that he displayed, all of those things, all of those aspects are a type of consciousness that he held, that he lived in almost all, perhaps all the time, or certainly most of the time, and demonstrated probably more fully than most souls in history that we have record of. So that kind of consciousness in Western mysticism is called Christ consciousness. It's not limited to association with Jesus in Western mystical writings that use that term, Christ consciousness. So from that perspective, the idea is that we attain union with the divine, not through the mind, not through pure awareness practices. It doesn't really talk about those, but that we attain union with the divine through love. That love is the quintessential essence of the divine, and that it is only through love that we awaken to the reality of the divine in us and around us, and that love is what enables us to have this sense of oneness with the divine and to live at least occasionally, if not always, in that state of consciousness. And so love is primary. And because love traditionally in almost all spiritual traditions is associated with the heart is primary in Christ consciousness development, not the mind and not pure awareness. And not that any of these are completely disconnected from the other, but what's the central emphasis? So the central emphasis in Christ consciousness is love. and through love, experiencing this union with the divine. So it is a process not of developing love, which is an important understanding. It is a process of awakening to that love, which already exists, becoming awake to this. And another term that's often used is unconditional love, awakening to this unconditional love, which basically, in one sense, is misleading, but in another sense, is trying to convey, I believe, a universality to its availability. Not that you have to love things that are unacceptable or evil or terrible, not that, but the universality of being able to experience this reality of this omnipresent energy or dynamic or aspect, divine aspect called love. And in this, there's also ego that's taught and ego that's presented. Ego is often in these traditions talked of as in an adversarial sense, that it is that in us which kind of opposes our awakening to the Christ consciousness and does its best to distract, tempt, frighten, or somehow turn us away from that realization. And the method for dealing with ego in these kind of Christ conscious traditions is not primarily mind or affirmations or mental practices, not primarily awareness practices. The the primary avenue in Christ consciousness development is the ending the separation and control of the ego in our lives by relationship with the divine. And that as we experience, not just think about or believe in, but as we experience with our being, with our mind, emotions, and body, as we experience more of the reality of the divine within us and everywhere around us, and engage that relationship, that the answer to the ego dominion is actually relationship, or more appropriately, loving relationship. As we engage in loving relationship with the divine, as we engage in loving relationship with one another and focus on that, that begins to diminish the power the ego has on us and its influence on us. Not that it necessarily disappears, but that its power to control us is greatly curtailed because we're more focused on experiencing and sharing and participating in that loving dynamic with one another and with the divine, both. So ego its effect is dissolved or lessened through relationship, loving relationship. And the other core part about this, which is emphasized much more strongly than in some of the self-realization techniques, and arguably more strongly than some of the enlightenment techniques. There tends to be an isolationism in some of those, in self-realization and enlightenment. There can be more of an isolation of practitioners with those. In the Christ consciousness, the whole idea is connection, and the attitude toward the world is not the world doesn't exist. It is not the world is just an illusion. It is not the world doesn't matter. It is not the world is a prison and the world is my problem. And if I get away from it, everything will be fine. It's not that. The way the world is approached in Christ consciousness is through compassion and forgiveness and willing service. So we approach the world with a state of forgiveness for all the problems it does cause us, with compassion, because we understand that everything that lives in it is doomed to death and is suffering from the effects of impermanence while it's seeking permanence. And we're willing to be of service to souls because we all need each other and we all need all the help we can get. And it's kind of together in a connected sense that we really come into a greater awakening and a greater harmony with one another. And ultimately, the ripple effect of that is a better society and a better world. So, okay, that's my 15-minute summary of three major traditions in terms of consciousness. Christ conscious, I did them in this order: self-realization, enlightenment, Christ consciousness. So that's kind of a lot in a short space, condensing quite a bit of teaching and stuff in a, I hope fairly concise, clear way to present it. So I'm going to pause there. Questions, comments, other input that doesn't relate to what I said. The topic relates to the topic, not necessarily something I just said. But anyway, opening it up. So anybody have anything you'd like to share?
You were either completely concise and answered all questions that everyone has on the whole nature of life, or they
That
all
was
left to go,
that's probably it. That's probably it.
or they left to go check the score on the Super Bowl.
Yeah, right. They got the Super Bowl on in one corner. I'm muted. Right, right. Yeah. Oh, Nahama and Shuli, go ahead, dude.
It's me.
Hey, Nahama.
Um,
Um,
have-
I'm looking
we
for.
both
Okay.
start? No, go ahead.
No, go
Okay.
ahead. Go ahead. You're good.
Apparently both of us have things we want to share.
Great.
Um, yeah, I I understand what you're talking about when you use the term Christ consciousness. Yet, as a Jew, when people start talking about Christ, I am excluded 100%. So
Hmm.
I know that concept.
Hmm.
I struggle with it being called Christ
Yeah.
consciousness
Yeah.
because there's an implication that it comes from Christianity. And that
Exactly.
has
Exactly.
always been the experience. And many times it's been the opposite. Um, and in my own Jewish path, the spiritual path, I have found ways to exactly what you're talking about.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
through my studies with Shefa and Love at the Center,
Exactly.
all about love and God's love.
Exactly.
And then, my own Shema, which I've shared with you in the past,
Hmm.
is talking about the oneness
That's right. That's
that
right.
we all are,
Yeah.
that it's all. So I, I agree with love and this kind of oneness, and that the way to get to that and what we get from it is love.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, I
Yeah.
just,
That's a really, really good point. I'm glad you made it. Um, and if you switch it to Messianic consciousness, you have the same problem in reverse. It's kind of associated with Judaism, and this consciousness isn't Jewish or Christian, clearly. You know,
love consciousness.
well, I like that. That's good. That's good. I'm going to jot that down. Thank you. That's a good one. I think it's much more accurate. But in a lot of the literature, Western mysticism, a lot of literature, you read Christ consciousness stuff, and it really isn't associated with Jesus, but the implication is it comes from Christianity. So yeah,
Right. And I could say Jesus was a nice Jewish boy.
yeah, well,
And
yeah, exactly. I think he was a very nice Jewish boy.
that also can be very offensive to people.
Oh, I
And
know,
so,
I know,
yeah.
I
So,
I
yeah.
know. It's surprising to me. I learned early on when I started teaching some of this stuff about the original teachings of Yeshua and how that differed from what church, much of what church doctrine is today, and so on. I expected a lot of pushback on that main idea. But what I didn't expect was I would start out with things like, well, Jesus was born and raised a Jew, and right off the bat, people were really offended. It's like, what, what, what? Well, of course, he was a Jew. All of his
Well, they
disciples
should
were.
get over it.
Yeah.
When I was 12, I had this conversation with this. We were standing in line for lunch, and she asked what church I went to. And I said, I don't go to a church. And,
Mhm.
we talked and, because Jews go to synagogues. And I said to her, especially after having read The Bronze Bow,
Right,
I
right.
had the concept of what Jesus was about. And I
Mhm.
said, isn't it more important to believe the teachings? And that's what I hear you saying.
Mhm.
This is what was taught,
Mhm.
was love, caring for one another,
Yeah.
those kinds of things, compassion. Um, and I'm probably missing all kinds of things too, because I could go on and on and on, but that's kind of the focus I get with the love is compassion and caring and supporting one another and helping take care of each other. And she said, "Oh no, that's not what's important.
Oh, I know.
It wasn't what Jesus taught.
I
It was
know.
what you believed about Jesus."
I know.
And so that's where I think I began at that point in my life. I said, I guess religion's not for me. And it wasn't until I started my spiritual path in my adulthood that I went, oh, that's what religion's for, is to find like-minded souls.
Right.
And I
Right.
started with my tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's good. Thank you, Nahama. That's really wonderful and important stuff. Shuli, I hear you have something too.
Yes, besides the usual one, later on, please be a good boy and stick your tongue out Auntie for her football comment on the Super Bowl.
Okay, I will do that.
Not one of those people, though I'm sure Lance is probably hiding as to why he's not on.
Oh, he is. He positively is. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So too bad, because he'd have fun at this poking. The poking for Auntie is her weather report is that it was just about nearly 70 here today as a warm, but it was cold
After
this morning.
29 this morning.
Yeah, after a 29-degree, we had a freeze last night.
Yeah.
So by the afternoon, we were a bit too overdressed, of course, but but that's here, and that perfect weather for you guys to play music if you were down here.
True. Very true, Shuli. Yes.
So, there is a flip side to you coming down
So your
here.
comment.
Okay,
True.
I actually had two things. One, well, they sort of connect with each other. When you were talking about illusion,
Hmm.
the first sort of me being a troublemaker, what popped into my head was the illusion of normal. Because you know how we joke, what's normal, define normal. And of course we can't. It's, our day-to-day activities and stuff is what's normal. And then when something happens, it's not normal.
Not normal. Yeah.
So you can't really define what normal is. So there's an illusion in a way.
Very much so. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that was one thing. And the other thing, for some odd reason, what also came to mind, and I'm reading right now, is thank goodness you're both bookworms, is dystopian fantasy.
Yeah.
And how they're all, in a way, they're all set in the same kind of frame of, it's, I guess you could say, in a way, post-apocalyptic in a form or another.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they all have this certain society where people are all in, but
Yep.
then you have this one group is completely different and is completely different than that strict form.
Yes.
And that's where you get your rebellion and everything else. And I don't know why that popped into my head while you were talking. Maybe it's a form of illusion as well. That we're all a certain mindset, which we all know that's, and all thinking alike and all of this sort of stuff, which of course we're all different and completely different in our own ways. So maybe that's what came up. I don't know.
That's good. And that's interesting. Yeah. Thank you, Shuli. I always appreciate both of your comments. I've got a few. I'm going to do Anna. I'm going to do them in the order I saw them. Anna, we'll go to Anna next, and then Ani, and then Lois. So Anna, whenever you're ready.
I'd just like to have you give some feedback on the drug-induced consciousness, higher consciousness that people talk about, the ayahuasca journeys, the LSD journeys. where they feel that they have had a spiritual awakening or they have found something.
Yeah.
Can you comment on what that's all about?
Yes. First of all, I want to qualify that by saying most, to the best of my ability, everything that I teach is something that comes out of my experience because I feel like that's where we have the most authority is what we've actually experienced. But, and I haven't done any drugs, so I have zero experience with that. So this is my understanding outside of having that experience myself, because I don't know that. But what I have seen and heard people report from those kind of experiences, um, this gets very complex and is too big a scope for the time we have right now. But you and I can talk later, or we can do it in another meeting when we have longer and start earlier. But there is within the human body an energy network, as you well know. And in the Indian writings, it's called the chakra system. Drugs, being a biochemical process, energetically affect the chakras. They affect different ones in different ways. Stimulating or constricting certain chakras in a certain sequence can produce certain psychic states of awareness, hallucinogenic states, or sometimes out of the body experiences. And people can actually have a genuine out of body experience of a higher state of consciousness through that's drug induced because of the effect it had on that particular. Usually it's the solar plexus or throat chakra, usually. And um, and so most of those are fantasy hallucinogenic experiences, but some are genuine experiences, but the problem remains that the only way they can access those states is through the drug use. And all spiritual traditions, almost, there's some native that aren't, but almost all spiritual traditions um, do not advocate the use of drugs to attain different states of consciousness because there's no accessibility without the drug, and we don't find the natural ways to enter those states, and therefore they're not ours. We might experience them, but we don't own them. So it's definitely not recommended. And some of those drugs have very damaging effects on the brain, long-lasting damaging effects on the brain and the structure of the synaptic interactions. So it's personally something I highly recommend against. But to get into a lot more detail, I would need more time, and we don't have that right now. So I hope that's at least something.
No, that's helpful because I have heard people's experiences and describing them. And I'm thinking it's like if I have a deep meditation experience, it's like I'm having an experience without the drug. And these people
Right,
are sort of describing a similar type of thing using a drug.
right. But
So,
when you have the experience in meditation or some other spiritual practice, you're actually building neural pathways that help stimulate an environment in the brain that's receptive to those higher states. Whereas when you do the drug, it's a very transient process, and it's not really, unless you do the drug all the time, and then you're building a neural pathway. But what you're also building is damage to the neural pathway that eventually it's going to, um, rather than opening a conduit or a pathway, it's going to restrict your ability to perceive to this very narrow pathway.
mhm,
It's a very sticky, limiting thing as opposed to an expansive process.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's my understanding, but again, I haven't done it, so, and I don't want to. But, but anyway, thank you, Anna. Ani.
Yeah, I was thinking about Nahama's contribution about the what's the word I want? Restrictive, that's not the right word. Excluding the exclusive
Yeah.
nature of the word Christ consciousness. And
Mhm.
I thought, well, that's true of just about every as soon as you start putting labels on it,
Yeah.
you're putting a fence around it, you're putting a wall around it, you're putting a barrier between somebody and that thing and that concept. And I wonder if it's and it I wonder if sometimes it's just because we have to talk in language, first of all, to communicate, and language is going to be, it's going to illuminate certain things, but it's also going to eliminate certain things. Um,
I like that. Language illuminates and eliminates. I like those two phrases, two
right,
words.
right,
Thank
right.
you. Keep going.
And and so I thought, um, so that's the first thing. And I've just been aware in certain conversations that it's critical to speak to people in the language they can understand.
Mm.
And there are certain people in certain more orthodox or fundamental traditions that would be very suspicious of and aghast at and afraid of some of what you discussed tonight, depending on the terminology that you used. I've heard you speaking with people, you're much better at it than I am. I've heard you speaking with people and using words that they could understand. And I want to be clear here. I'm not saying you've been deceptive or that you're dressing things up kind of, wolf in sheep's clothing style. I don't mean that at all. I mean, you're actually using language that people can understand so they can understand the concepts. And for some people who follow a more traditional Christianity, then saying Christ consciousness opens a gate in that wall that so they won't be afraid of the word consciousness, first of all, and meditation or going within or what. I mean, you just have to use the language that people can understand. Unless some people, unless you're going, I mean, it's very rare to find somebody, period, who's just open to all sorts of things, and is just truly willing to say, okay, that sounds interesting. Tell me more about it because I'm not familiar with it. Most people have an innate suspicion of things they're not familiar with. I think it's probably a survival technique back to our lizard brain or something. If we don't know about it, well, we got to be really careful about it,
Right.
like cats with cucumbers or something. You have to be very careful. And so putting something in more familiar language or concepts can often help people approach the barrier in a less fearful manner. So, but anyway, that was all the things when Hama was talking about the Christ consciousness. I guess I'm used to so many different
Mm.
traditions and
Mm.
concepts that all of them come up with that it isn't that frightening to me. But I know that there are people who are very afraid of anything that isn't in their particular neck of the woods, so to speak, whether they've been brought up with it or whatever. So
Mm.
um, that's what I was thinking about. That's all.
I appreciate that. You just gave me a very pleasant experience in terms of it's rare to find people who are really just open and want to know what you think and tell me more about that because I don't know about it. And Rabbi Fox popped in.
I
And,
thought of him
and
too. Yes,
yeah,
he was
because he was very good at that. He was so good at that.
open to everything. He didn't
Yeah.
care.
He was
It didn't matter what tradition you came from,
no.
who you were, and sadly, we've even recently had an experience where somebody in a place that I consider very open to people of all, very inclusive,
I
very
know what you're talking about.
diverse, very
Mhm.
whatever,
Mhm.
was very um I don't know if hostile is the right word. That's probably putting too much
Well,
energy.
defensive at least.
Yes, it's like, well, what are they doing here? Because
Yeah.
they believe much more traditionally than we do. And I'm thinking, So what? So what? They believe more traditionally. Who cares? You
Mhm.
know, they're willing to come here and listen. Who cares what their particular, little thing is? As long as they're not trying to off us, I don't care. Come on in. So,
Yeah, yeah.
okay.
Anyway, thank you for the comment. So the next two I've got Lois, if you want to go ahead, and then after you, James.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Lois.
Just because this is related to something I experienced this morning, I wanted to share since we're talking about the Christ consciousness. We had a new person at Unity, and we had met for a class. And then after the class, we took some time to talk to this person, and she wanted to know the books and everything, what to do. And we started talking about the principles and the main things, not any dogma with Unity. We don't have that, but main things that we use as tools.
Mhm.
And she really got hung up on the Christ consciousness. And then I saw where she got like her brain lit up. You know what I mean? Like it was
Yeah.
an aha moment for
Yeah,
her.
yeah.
And she didn't say what faith or whatever she had come from. But I said, you know what helped me along the way, because that was real foreign and that was ego, if I would say this back then. But well, I said her name, Christ, and then I said a couple other people in the names, Christ, and I said my name, Lois Christ, and it was like, now that made sense. And I said it wasn't just Christ wasn't the first one, but there were many before Christ and there were many after.
Mm,
So I said, don't get hung up on that part, but we're made in image and likeness of God. God created Jesus Christ, correct? So all of us have that spark of God, and all of us have that Christ consciousness. We
Mm.
can't deny it,
mhm,
and it's all based on the loving of God.
mhm,
So there you are.
mhm. Cool. That's nice. Thank you, Lois. Yeah,
You're
it's
welcome.
like the Buddha. Originally, there was just Buddha, and then as things progress, people understood there was a Buddha consciousness that is
Yeah,
innate in everybody. It's another way of talking about what you're talking about.
the same thing. Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you, Lois.
you're
James, go
welcome.
ahead.
Lois, are you done?
Yeah, I'm trying to get my mute
You
thing.
just want to make
Give me
sure.
a moment. I will get it.
Well, I am back in Texas after being in 19-degree weather. It is now 80. So I am
I'm
very
Are you
sorry.
happy camper?
I'm so
yes.
sorry, James. I'm so sorry you're back in 80-degree weather. I'm so
No,
sorry.
I'm gonna be moving up there in 3.5 years. I need to get used to it. So
Are you?
yeah,
Woo!
yeah, that's our retirement home.
Oh, lovely. God willing, I'll still be here by then and we'll connect and that'll be great.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. So no, and I wanted to comment on something Nechama said, because I had almost exactly the same experience as she did at the same age.
interesting.
Yeah, because it was when I was in sixth grade, and there was a very fundamentalist girl who had a crush on me, and she called me up one day and asked me about what I went to, and I said, "Well, I do Heartlight."
Oh,
At the time we were doing Heartlight,
right.
that group, and she said, "Oh, that's a cult," and it's like, well, heck with you, But I thought it was very interesting how we had the same experience. It's like whenever you're outside the norm, and of course, I don't know where you were, Nakama, but I was in Northeast Indiana, where everything's very conservative.
Mhm.
I was
And
in Waco.
you were where?
In Waco.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know all about Waco. So, so yeah, it was just very interesting just to see, like, someone had the same experience I did at the same time.
Really, really.
So, there you go.
That's wild.
Mhm.
I want to take a moment. We're almost at the end, but I wanted to take a moment. We talked about this last week, and Allison was kind enough to send it to me. She mentioned about a United Methodist statement. Um, and anyway, she found some things from the United Methodist social principles. I grew up in the United Methodist Church, so um, this is not something my church would have said when I was a child, or at least when I was young. But I really thought this was profound, and I wanted to conclude this tonight. So I'll wrap up with this. Anything that anybody had anything to share we didn't get to, or comments you want to share, email me or just jot it down and send me a note that you didn't get to, and we'll start with you next week. This is short, and then we'll close. But I think it's significant, particularly in light of so much we see going on in the world around us, on both sides of both left and right, whatever you want to call these different ideologies, but the far left, far right, all these different clashes we see. This is a statement that the United Methodist has put out on their social principles, and it's like 3 paragraphs. So I think it's really important, and at least to me, and I wanted to share it with you, also to share it as an example of how very traditional and mainstream churches have, many of them at least, are less exclusive and more accepting of other perspectives than they were, at least in my experience, as I investigated them when I was younger. We affirm the rights of all religious minorities to worship in peace and to exercise their faith free of fear of discrimination or persecution. We condemn actions by any individual or group or organization that denigrates or demeans those belonging to another faith. As Christians, we consider those attitudes and actions to be completely antithetical to Jesus' command to love one's neighbor. We urge all governments, businesses, churches, synagogues, and other institutions in civil society to take concerted action to protect the rights of all religious people, regardless of their faith. We object to any form of discrimination or intolerance toward religious minorities, including any laws that ban religious clothing or symbols, or ban statements from public officials, and statements from public officials that would incite intolerance, hatred, or even violence toward others. We call for responsible media coverage of religions and condemn the continuing dissemination of religious stereotypes and untruths about religious groups and minorities. We endorse the right of all people to practice their faith, free from any unnecessary legal, political, or financial restraints. We support the right of all individuals to choose and practice their own faith, and reject all attempts to impose beliefs on other people or in any way to coerce and manipulate them into joining or remaining part of a religious tradition from which they have decided to disaffiliate. Individual religious belief and practice must never be used to deny basic human rights anywhere. There is nothing I disagree with in that statement personally, and I think it's a very important, thank you, some of the hearts I'm seeing float up. I think it's an important, I wish there were a way to convey that to our social media, to our news media, to our political leaders, and to people in general. And it would be, if just those 3 paragraphs were actually practiced, it would change so many things for the better. So thank you, Allison, for taking the time to find that and share it with me, and God bless you.
Yay, Allison and Allison's congregation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
So-
thank you, James.
Yes. Yes. The distinctions that divide us in terms of belief and practice are nothing compared to the love that binds us. So if we would focus more on that, we would have a lot less problem. Thank you all so much for your kind attention tonight. We'll continue this again next week. And if any of you didn't get a chance to share something, drop me an email. I'll make sure we start with you next week. Also, anything you want to comment on, feel free to email me. I love hearing from you. So let's just take a brief moment and recognize the compassion that the great leaders of all our great traditions have displayed and promoted And may we become living examples of that kind of compassion to those in our world. Thank you for your presence and attention tonight. Love you all. See you next week, and some of you before then, I hope. All right. Good night.